Welcome to Mindfulness Manufacturing. My name is Trevor Blondeel. Spending 25 years in manufacturing, I discovered the real impact we have on turnover, communication, and the ability to manage change is how we show up. That's the essence of emotional intelligence. In each episode, we bring a guest or message to expand your skills, engage your people, and grow your organization. So let's jump in. I know for me, one of the uncomfortable moments in manufacturing is when the customer calls and looking for that 1, 2, 3% cost savings, or that our budget's being done and we've got to figure out ways to save. So I bring people into the boardroom and hope some ideas fall out, or I just feel that extra weight, right? We want to have great ideas. We want to have those innovations, cost savings, keep competitive, especially in North America. And what about a system to do that? So I never had a system, but I had a pretty good team. And later to find out that there are systems around creativity. So I found a friend, Dr. Amy Climer, that teaches teams and organizations how to increase their creativity so they can maximize innovation. And she works with forward-thinking organizations like the Mayo Clinic, which is a big deal in Minnesota, and a totally different area that I didn't even know about in medicine until I read Dr. Amy's book. And she's also done work with Ecolab and other manufacturing companies. So welcome to the show, Amy.
Thank you, Trevor. It's so good to be here.
So I've just read your book. You really already changed my thinking. Like when we talk with manufacturing greatness, it's a lot about deeper conversations. It's talking about the real problems below. And I didn't really think about this whole aspect of creativity and having a system around it. So thanks for writing this.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate it. It's definitely been a labor of love. About 2 years actually writing, but then the initial research I did, I started about 10 years ago, and there's stories in there from my consulting clients, and I'm so excited that it's finally out in the world.
So you came up with this over the years. What started this? Like, how did you start realizing that, hey, there's a system on creativity? Because I think of creativity that I couldn't draw very well. And you could talk about that a little bit. And it's not about drawing, right? It's about having different ideas. And I've actually learned that I am much more creative now that I've been writing more. And so there's a lot of material that really resonated with me and how you've done so much research on this and practiced it so much. But did you just realize you had this gift to facilitate this creativity?
It wasn't quite that magical or simple. I did, like early in my career, in my 20s, even starting as far back as college, I learned how to facilitate. And I really worked hard at honing that skill and getting good at facilitating teams. I have led, I don't even know how many kind of classic team building programs or team building events. And I don't do that as much anymore because I've morphed that into something that I think is a bit more meaningful and deeper. But along the way, I was very curious about creativity. And early in my career, and Trevor, I'm curious if you've had this experience, I had been on many different teams, and some of the teams were highly creative, and some of them weren't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was just like the opposite. They were just uncreative, for lack of a better word. But the people on both teams were intelligent, smart, engaged. And I was like, what is the difference between these groups? And I really started getting into the research and studying and going to trainings, and eventually figured out, oh, there's this whole system around creativity that if we know it and we're paying attention and using it, it's like magic almost. It works. It's amazing. And there's all this research that shows if you are following a system, you will be more creative. It's kind of like a lot of other things.
I think this is resonates with our audience is that we like systems.
Yes.
Right? Manufacturing is built on a lot of repeatability. And so we have standards, we got to follow procedures. When you make something and you buy it, you expect it to be a certain way. So you need a repeatable process to get a repeatable output. Sometimes I felt as an operator, it's okay, I just got to follow the standard work. But then it's an and, right? So we got to follow standard work, but then, and how can we do this a little bit differently? Yeah. And when we bring those people together and it's okay, so just tell me your ideas. It felt clunky for me.
Yeah. And I think that's the experience many people have. What I figured out is that there are these techniques, tools, approaches that we can use that even though the problem might be vastly different, if we follow these methodologies, then that the methodology itself is familiar and creativity becomes repeatable.
Mm.
And eventually you can be a team that is consistently producing creative or innovative results. And that seems pretty cool to me.
Yes. When it actually came, like, you talked about a $40,000 a year savings. What was it was a manufacturing example you had?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll admit this was not my personal experience. This happened. It's a classic story where there's a plant. It was actually a GM plant up in New York. And they were having this issue in the factory when they stamped, like they had a die that stamped into the metal to make one of their parts, that about once a week, the die would get stuck and it would break. And every time it broke, it was really expensive. I think every time it broke, it was about $40,000.
Okay.
This was happening on a weekly basis. So this is a $1.5 million a year problem. The team had gone through a creativity training. It's the same kind of training that I lead. And they were like, okay, we need to sit down and figure this out. They got together for about an hour. They followed the process called creative problem solving. And the way the process works is you start off and you clarify the problem. So they're trying to really understand what's going on. And then from there, you move into ideate. And in the ideate phase, one of the engineers said, my wife has this stuff that she uses when she's cooking called Pam spray. He sprays it on the pan and then the food doesn't stick to the pan. So I'm wondering if we could do something like that. And
Mm.
then somebody else said, oh, you know what? Instead of using Pam, let's use this mixture of the soap and something else. And they got so excited, they stopped the meeting. One guy ran down to the hardware store and bought $1 spray bottle. Somebody else went over to the lab and mixed up the soapy mixture, and they sprayed it on the die, and it worked like a champ.
Mm.
And so by pausing and taking, in this case, it just took an hour, they saved $1.5 million a year. One is that they had all been through creativity training. And
Mm.
I think that is really important for teams and leaders to get that type of training, because once they learn the process, you can just use it anytime.
So it's a different way of thinking because I don't remember sitting on the line or in the boardroom doing my A3 problem solving, thinking about like material at home. And I think that's where we do get stuck, right? It's okay. So it's the welder, it's this bad weld, this is where it comes from. We check the material. What other things can we look at? We look at different processes within the building. But what you're saying is it's just like a little bit more of a pause.
And I think if you can get outside of that bubble that you're typically in, like you're saying, can be really helpful. Sometimes even bringing in people from the outside, it might even be like, hey, everyone, just like bring somebody from your family to this ideation session.
Yeah.
Here's an example. Recently, I was at one of my clients in their eco lab, and they make like soaps, and this particular plant makes soap for other companies. Like they make soap for McDonald's and Walmart. And as we're touring, they're showing me a machine that they have. And they said, this machine is our biggest problem. It's
Mm.
30 years old. It was gigantic. And it, because it's so old, we're the only facility left in the country with this machine. And anytime it breaks, the only way we can get parts is to buy them on eBay. And I don't actually know a ton about manufacturing. Like nothing like you do. But I'm coming in from the outside and I said, oh, sounds like you all need a 3D printer. She looked at me and she was like, wow, that's a really good idea. You
Make
could
your own
just print
parts.
your own parts right
Yeah.
here. All you need is the CAD
Mhm.
design or whatever. And so I think that's just an example of bringing in some outside perspective, particularly people who are particularly good at ideating can help, but also you can teach your own people how to be good at it.
Yeah, and that's the intent with your book, right? Is that teams could read your book, practice some of the methods on there, and hey, how can we either get because that is not unique, having a 30-year-old piece of equipment that you can't get parts for,
Right.
and that you can find that in most manufacturing plants. So yeah, like the 3-day printer, what are different ways that we can make those parts? What do we need how much is our downtime? How much do we need to store on hand? And then
Yep.
yeah, you do the analysis and all of a sudden, you know what, maybe we don't have to replace this machine that quickly.
Mhm.
if we have some different alternatives. Because when you're trying to find $10 million in savings, you got to be really creative, right? The 3D printer, that could be just one of them.
Like, they're not that expensive anymore, the 3D printers. So,
So I like the three circles that you had, which was one was team purpose, one's team dynamics, and one's team creative process. So the purpose, I like the word just clarity for ourselves so that teams can individually speak about what is our purpose. So talk a little bit about that because I am working with plants right now. And I've heard people on the executive team say, I just don't have clarity, priorities. And then I talked to the CEO and they're, yeah, we've explained what the goals are. So it's okay. But what's the disconnect here? How
it's
are you
not
solving
yeah,
that problem?
it's not getting through. Yeah, that actually I think is a fairly common problem where the CEO feels like they've explained what the priorities are or explained the situation, and those under them aren't quite getting it, or maybe there's some gaps. And I would say what's most important is, are the people getting it, not that you explained it. So, just
Oh,
to
you didn't get it? Let me explain it again, Amy.
yeah, you're like, we might need a different approach. So I call it the deliberate creative team system. And one of them, usually it's the first one you're going to look at, not always, but usually is team purpose. And so what is the purpose of our team? And what happens in a lot of organizations is there's a very clear mission for the company. But then when it comes to each team, there might not be clarity about what is that team's purpose. Why do they meet? What are they supposed to focus on? And I think this really comes up when there's a particular problem. It's which team owns this problem? Who should be
Mm,
focusing on it? And if we are focusing on this problem, what's our scope? Are we making the decision? Are we recommending a decision to the executive team? That sort of thing. And I've seen this a lot where I guess there's layers to this, right? So there's the team purpose, but then there's also the priorities set from leadership. And I have seen this a lot where teams are practically begging leadership, please tell us what the priorities are. And leadership won't do it.
yes.
And I think there's two things. One, leadership might not know. They're not actually sure. And so they're being vague about it. Or maybe there's just a disconnect from a communication level. Years ago, I was working with a team that was going through massive change within this organization. It was a HR department and they were reorganized everything. And so we had three teams that I was working with, and everybody on the team was more or less doing two jobs during this reorganization. High level of stress, but also high level of commitment.
Mm,
And they said, Amy, we can't get our supervisor, the director, to give us the directives of what's the priority. Can you talk to them? So I went and talked to him, and he was still equally vague. Oh, everything's a priority. Okay, that's not going to work. So we went back and we got the three teams together in a room and we just mapped it out. It took us about half a day. We had Post-it notes, we had big whiteboard, and we just mapped out the priorities. This is what we're doing because we're not getting any other direction. And it worked fine. The leadership didn't balk at it. They accepted it. But I do think in some ways you have to get some clarity of purpose and priorities that everyone is on board with.
Yeah, because you want those decisions to be made, right? I know what the priority is, and then the other one you hear is they change, right? Like our clarity, we don't have clarity because it seems like the priorities are changing. It does change, right? So you need something that higher level to say, hey, this is for our department. This is what the priority is, but it connects to the overall purpose of this whole organization. And I think people do starve for that. I just want to know what's important. If I'm told to be on the shop floor, then okay, so then what's the purpose of being on the shop floor? What's the outcome? And I think if we can have that kind of gets into your second one, the team dynamics, but this is what we really focus on is having those deeper conversations of what does purpose look like? What does it look like in action? If I know purpose, what does it sound like? How would I say it? And
Mhm.
then if we could go back and forth a little bit and have that dialogue, we can get connected on what good looks like. And then that just allows us to be more creative because we're not thinking about, so what are we doing here?
Yeah. And I think that clarity of purpose, it does connect to the dynamics. It helps people feel more connected to the team. And if there's clarity of purpose, it helps make decisions because you can decide, especially if it's, should we do this or not? Does this meet the purpose we're trying to get at in the best way possible? I also think another layer to that is the values. Is there clarity around values? Years ago, I worked with an organization. It was actually a pizza franchise that just did some actually really interesting work in the sense that, they made pizzas, right? But they were really focused on just building up their employees, who a lot of them were just college students, right? Just like, hey, we want this to be like a leadership development program in the pizza shop. Anyway, so one of the things they did is they were very clear about their values. Every single meeting in the company, no matter what the purpose of the meeting was, it always started out with somebody had to share something around one of the values that they saw in action. If integrity was a value, then they would say whoever starts the meeting says, hey, who has some examples from values this week? And it could be something they saw at the grocery store. It didn't have to be within the company. But what it did, it was so cool. And what it did is it helped people just constantly think about those values. And it was also just a really cool, positive way to kick off the meeting. The company. It wasn't just, we're talking about our favorite vacation kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. If values are that important, then are we talking about how that integrates into this meeting, this conversation, if we can kick it off each time? And that's just a more creative way to do it.
Yeah.
Right. Because sometimes you'll see it inside outside, but then that just makes our job. We have less energy into making decisions because we know, okay, we know these are our values. I don't have to ask about it because I know that if I check back on these 4 or 5 main values, it checks the boxes on these. And it just feels right because this is just how we operate. And what I like you said about the pizza place is that with manufacturing, especially if it's a corporation that has different manufacturing plants, is which one is the lead that people want to go work at? Like, which is the one that I'm going to, one, be on a winning team, and 2, that I'm going to learn. There's a waiting list to get into that plant because you get in there and you're going to be taking action. You're going to be learning to be more creative. You're going to feel valued because you know what the purpose is, and team dynamics. That's the other circle in your Venn diagram.
Yeah, I think team dynamics they're super important. And of the 3 elements that I talk about, it's the one that might be the hardest to get really good at. And so by team dynamics, the behaviors and interactions between team members. So what's happening in a team meeting? What's happening in the hallway? Specifically, the areas that I looked at that are most important for creativity is team members need to have at least a moderate to high level of trust with each other. They need to be able to communicate well with each other, but not exclusively. They also need to communicate outside of the team. You don't want to get too insular. And then the last one is they need to be able to engage in a type of conflict called creative abrasion. This actually comes from manufacturing, from Nissan. Was it the 80s or 90s? I think it was the 80s. Jerry Hirschberg, he was hired by Nissan. He was a car guy, worked at another plant. He was hired by Nissan because Nissan was bringing this Japanese company over to the US, and they wanted to pair Japanese attention to engineering detail with American innovation. And so he has these teams that are so different from each other, right? He said they couldn't even agree on what radio station to listen to or what clothes to wear to work. Just such culture clash. And he loved it. And he eventually realized that what they wanted was this ability to disagree around the work. So an idea gets shared or they're looking at ideas, and if everyone ignores, if there's disagreement but no one's talking about it, then you risk going into groupthink, which is where you value this like perceived harmony over the real work. And that can be really dangerous, not helpful. Come on, let's get real here. And then, of course, the other end of the spectrum is you're just disagreeing all the time, and that's not helpful either. But that sweet spot is creative abrasion that you want to go for.
Oh, yeah, I'll be using that term, creative abrasion, because we call it a little bit of sandpaper. I've heard different terminologies.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that now I've been on teams where we had somebody come in hired from the outside on our executive team and came in and was like, you guys are way too nice. And she was right. It was, so we just said, hey, what did we do last year? With the exception of when I got hit with those cost savings and I had to get a little bit of creativity, I could usually just follow what we've done. But when we do trust each other and we're vulnerable with what we're concerned about, then we can question each other and it's not personal. It's just about the better purpose. We've got the purpose, we've got the dynamics. I want the listeners, as they're driving in and they say, okay, Amy, I've got a decent purpose. Our dynamics are pretty good. What's something I could do today for the creative process?
Yeah. So that's the third circle is the creative process. And what I have found is very few teams even know that there is a process to be creative, much less are using it. And so that's the first thing. And I would recommend getting the book and checking it out.
Yeah.
But I'll just give you like one little thing you can experiment with today. So one of the tools under the whole creative process is the way you ask questions impacts the type of ideas you get. So I say that all the time. And often what we say in a team meeting or just even out on the shop floors, oh, how should we? And we use that phrase should. And when you're using the phrase should, you're looking for the right answer. How should we fix this machine? How should we change this process? And once in a while, that's appropriate, but usually there's not one right answer. You're looking for ideas. And so instead, changing the phrase to how might we? So,
Mm,
how might we change this process to make it better? And when you ask how might, you're inviting like possibility. And now you're not looking for a right answer because there isn't. There's rarely
mhm.
a right answer in the work we do as adults. And I found that this how might we sometimes if it sounds a little funny when you first start using it because it just feels a
Yeah.
little different, but pretty soon it will be natural and you will see different responses. And so just today at work, play with that. If you're on your way home, try
Mhm.
it at home with your family or whoever you live with, or if you're out to dinner with some friends and something comes up, just try to change your sentence to say, how might we, and see what happens.
Yeah. I appreciate that because one section that I've written in my book is just words matter.
Yeah.
And this whole thing of, well, words don't matter that much. A previous guest and a friend of yours, Patricia Fripp, makes it very clear that words do matter and that study is flawed and changing from how should we to how might we do
Oh my.
this? Something I've done is just if this was working, what would be different, right? But like, how might we? That's powerful, Amy. I appreciate that. That's just taking that one shift in our language because it's how we show up impacts on how other people feel. So how we ask our questions. And one of my favorite quotes out of your book was, "I know it seems obvious, but obvious does not mean easy."
Mm. It's so true. It's like all this stuff all of us have learned. If anyone's listening to this podcast, they care about getting better in some way in
Yeah,
their life. And a lot of the stuff you hear is, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then are you actually doing it? Because, yeah, it's hard. It can be really hard.
you've made me smarter, Amy,
Oh,
because I can see this a little bit differently. I can see as once we get those first couple models of the purpose and the cohesion going, it's, oh, you know what? This is going to be some material. I could see a team just reading your book and going through it together. Yeah. How do you want, what do you want to leave the listeners with thinking? If they're walking into the plant today and they think of Dr. Amy Clymer, what do you want them to tell others about you?
the phrase that I use all the time that it's like become my signature phrase is be deliberate to be creative because it will not happen by accident. I think that's one of the myths of creativity is that eventually I'll get a good idea. It's not how it works at all. It's really about a system. Check out the book. It's called Deliberate
Yeah.
Creative Teams: How to Lead for Innovative Results. And it just came out. In fact, I'm working on this may be helpful for teams is I'm working on a facilitator guide. If you wanted to facilitate this
Mhm.
as a team leader, if you wanted to have everyone on your team have a copy and then work through some of it, it'll be available on my website pretty soon.
We'll leave links to your book, to your website in the show notes. If you want to know, get Amy in there, you can reach out to her directly. You can reach out to me. But I believe that there's an important reason why you've written this. You were called to write this.
Mm.
And I think it'd be transformational for manufacturing companies to be more deliberate in their creativity and how we innovate, how we do cost savings, and just how we think a little bit different. So thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and sharing, this different way of thinking for us, Amy.
Thank you, Trevor. I appreciate all the kindness you've said about my book. I'm really excited about it, and I hope it makes a big difference.
Hey folks, appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone. Haven't subscribed yet? Do it now. Remember, if you want results, the key is increasing your awareness of how you show up.